Very much, Deputy Catherine Connolly.
I too will be supporting this bill, and I wish to thank Deputy McGrath for bringing it before the House, notwithstanding some of the weaknesses in it. I think there are weaknesses that can be teased out, and in any event it is a response to inaction by the Government. And I have to say, Minister Kenny, you have you look a little uncomfortable, and I appreciate that. I certainly agree with the comments made by the previous speaker in relation to Minister Murphy. I think his speech utterly fails to deal with the problems which have been raised. And as you know, Minister, you were down in Ballinasloe and you spoke down there, and I have to say it was an eye-opener for me, even though I come from Galway West, which has been seriously hit by flooding both within the city and down in Cong, Clonbur, Kilmaine and all of those areas. It was an eye-opener for me to attend in Ballinasloe, a town I'm very familiar with because I worked there for many years in the 80s. But why it was an eye-opener for me was, number one, the National Flood Conference was organised, as you know, by a group locally in Ballinasloe and by an Athlone. Their level of professionalism was absolutely second to none. The facts and figures that put before us just caused me to stop in my tracks and listen to what they were saying, and I took notes as you did. And I came away from that conference and I thought, this is a group of people who are not asking for help. They're actually asking the Government to work with them. They have done the work on the ground, not alone in collecting the data, but they've done the work on the ground when the floods appeared and when there were no services from the Government at the time. And so, Minister, I'd appeal to you to listen, because I know your heart is in the right place, whatever about Fine Gael, and I have to say, they seem to be completely and utterly out of touch, reliant on a private market which has utterly failed, in the same way that it has failed to provide houses for our people, in the same way that it has failed to control the astronomical rise in car insurance, and also a government that has relied really on private companies to provide our health services. So I would appeal to you to actually listen. Number one, nobody is asking for charity here, least of all the group that organised the conference in Ballinasloe. Secondly, I'd like to just comment in relation to the history of the Government and my difficulty in relying on their reassurances that they're going to do something. 300 areas have been identified by your department, the Office of Public Works, in relation to risk assessments, and maps have been drawn up. The next plan, obviously, is the course of action and what we do about that. But if we look back, and I hear, Minister, that you're chairing the interdepartmental group, I sit on the Public Accounts Committee, as you know, and to our horror, it was brought to our attention some months ago by the Controller and Auditor General. A steering group established to plan Ireland's flood defences did not meet for 4 years up until November 2014. That's a black and white finding in the Controller and Auditor General's report. The report also found that an interdepartmental group, presumably the one you're chairing, set up to plan flood risk management, didn't meet for 6 years up until July 2015. I could go on, I won't, because there's no point in highlighting more. They're the Controller and Auditor General's findings, who generally gives very modest conclusions and sticks to facts. And so I wouldn't be reassured at all, number one, by the history to date of dealing with our flood problems. Outside of housing and health, flood was the biggest issue raised on the doors as we went along door to door. And we promised and we gave our word as candidates that should we be elected, we would focus on housing, health, public transport and flooding. They were the areas, and I make no apology for repeatedly standing up in this chamber and focusing in on those key issues. Galway, outside of Cork, received the most, applied and received the most assistance in terms of humanitarian assistance payments from the Department of Social Welfare. The number of houses in Galway alone was 158. That was higher than even Cork, although Cork received higher payments, probably higher valuations. There were just 74 who applied. 158 applied in Galway City and County for humanitarian assistance from the Department of Social and Welfare. I'm going to conclude by saying The Office of Public Works, who I greatly respect and who have done great work over the years, is left trying to do their best with the limited budget. And we as a Dáil, and certainly the government, hasn't grasped the enormity of the problem posed by flooding and the quantity of money needed to deal with flood defences. That's number one. Number two, climate change hasn't been mentioned at all in this debate tonight. And climate change is now a fact of life, and it has been repeatedly said by me and other TDs in this Dáil that this is the last Dáil, this is our last opportunity to deal with climate change, from which, besides bad planning, the failure to provide flood defences, the major cause of flooding going forward will be the change in climate. And we are still waiting the mitigation plan promised by the government. It still hasn't been produced. And we're now nearly into December, and still that mitigation plan hasn't come before this House, Ministers. I really don't know how you can sit there in the face of facts that can't be controverted. Climate change is happening and we have to take action. And so where is the national mitigation plan that we were promised? We are already exceeding the emissions set for us, and we're looking at a situation where we're going to be paying absolute millions in fines for failing to take action. So on every level, Ministers, we're utterly failing to deal with the problems. And that's bad enough. That's bad enough because each government has been negligent. But what's totally unacceptable is when local community groups come together, give us the facts and figures and tell us and beg us that they want to work with, then that is completely unacceptable. So I'm supporting this draft bill tonight, this draft legislation, although I do see weaknesses given my previous life in law, but I think I have no choice but to support it. At the very least, it might spur the government into taking action and stop giving us bland and empty rhetoric that the market will provide and rely on reassurances from insurance companies that have absolutely no intention of keeping their word.